The wildness was what I fell in love with, but in the end, I knew it would be what took her from me. It's not that we weren't happy some of the time. We were happy much of the time, which is more than most. Then it would come upon her. I'd see the look in her eyes, how she paced and flapped her hands, and it would begin again. The panic, the disappearances from home, neighbours and the police or coast guard knocking on my door. The sound of a helicopter over the water, searching. Sometimes it would just be me who found out first, so I'd go out to look for her myself. I'd walk the cliffs while a squall tugged at me, climb down onto the rocks while the tide spat and surged around me, never sure if it would take me like I feared it had taken her. I can remember the first time it happened. I came home from work to find her pacing around the house, as if it were a prison she couldn't leave. I wondered whether I'd done something to upset her, or whether she'd received bad news. She never spoke of family, but we all come from somewhere, even if we leave it behind us. "Sweetheart," I said, "what's wrong?" "I didn't always live here," she said, her eyes wild, looking all around her as if she was trapped. "Of course not." I tried to be calm and reassuring, although a storm of panic blew through my heart. I could see how unwell she was, how not her she was. "We've been together, just over a year, so that makes it only 6 months or so since you moved in." She stared at me. "Not here." "Here!" She flung her arm around. "I don't mean this room, not this house. I mean here." I wanted to cry at the despair in her voice, to take her and to hold her, and to make the pain and confusion I could see in her go away. "I don't remember how I came here," she said. "We moved you from your flat," I said. "You must remember, my love. We had that old VW estate, the green one, and we thought we'd never fit all of your—" She shook her head. I don't remember anything from before being here." I talked to her until her pacing stopped and she collapsed into a chair. And then I put her to bed and talked to her some more until she slept. I lay staring at the ceiling, mentally fatigued beyond all belief from the effort to calm her, but unable to sleep. At some point, though, I must have slid away, without even realizing it, as I woke to a cold hollow in the bed next to me, and the kind of banging on the front door that only someone official would make. She'd been seen far out on the rocks by an insomniac, walking his dog along the cliff tops despite the weather. He called out to her, tried to persuade her to pick her way back to the land, warned her that the tide was still rising. When she showed no signs of recognizing that he was even there, he called the police, and when she ignored them, they in turn had called out the lifeboat, and the lifeboat crew plucked her from the rocks and brought her ashore. One of the crew told the police that he knew where she lived, because he'd been out to fix our roof after the last storm had taken some tiles off. One police car took her to hospital, and the other came to my door, and then there was a blur of waiting rooms and machine coffee and off-white blinds, sad rows of beds, and that terrible hushed sound that pressed in on me like a weight when I sat with nothing to do but sit. Calm, busy people talked to her a lot, and to me a little. Dosages were adjusted, tentative diagnoses were made. After a few weeks she came home, calmer, but as if she'd retreated to somewhere deep inside herself. We lived a quiet, delicate life, never talking about what had happened. And if I drove her anywhere, I always took the inland route, never the coast road. And I shut the windows of the house at night, so she could never hear the sea, her obsession. After a few months, the light came back into her eyes, and our world came back into focus, and it was joyous and full of colour. I loved her more for all that had happened and how fragile I knew she was. After a while, though, it happened again. I came home to a house that was still in a way that went beyond mere emptiness. I thought that she was gone and was pacing fragile and desperate on the cliff tops while the waves boomed and called her. But I found her in our bedroom, staring into the ornate mirror that hung on the wall, and had been one of the only things my mother had left me. "Are you okay?" I asked, although I knew she wasn't. She stared into the mirror, as if she could see far beyond it. I stood with her for a while, giving her time and space, and my patience. because that was all I had to give her. "It's not me," she said in the end. "I don't know who I am." I put my hand on her shoulder. She was as rigid as if she were sculpted from rock. "It is you," I said, in a very gentle voice. "You just need a little help again. We've got through this before. We can—" "This is not me," she said again, not looking away from her own reflection, and she raised her fist as if to punch the mirror. I caught her slender wrist in my hand, could feel her pulse in it, fluttering like a tiny fish out of water breathing its last. "Please, no, you'll cut yourself, love." And the mirror, I thought. Please don't break the mirror. But I didn't say that. Instead, I bent my head and kissed the knuckles of her fist, tasted the salt of her skin. We stood there for a moment, and then she unbent, as if the air had been let out of her, and I picked her up and lifted her onto the bed. I sat next to her for a long time, stroking her soft hair that flowed around the curve of her face like water around rock. When she fell asleep, I made myself strong coffee, and I locked every door and put the keys in my pocket. I should have rung the hospital. I should have asked for help, but I didn't want the shame that I knew she felt from needing their help, and I was foolish enough to think that maybe this time I could help her myself. I took time off work, phoned in sick, did my best to be vigilant. It took her 2 days this time before she found her chance and got out of the house, and when they pulled her from the water this time, we were back to the hushed silences and bright lights. There were more weeks of waiting and of talking and trying of new medication, back into what I'd now come to realize was a cycle, would always be a cycle, the long, slow tides of our lives together. When the colour came back into our world and the light came back into her eyes this time, I loved her more than ever before. When I looked at her, though, I could always hear the sea like a halo of white noise around her. The last time happened when I had to go away on business for a couple of days. I didn't like to leave her. I never had. She was vulnerable, and just the thought made my heart twist. But I had to work. She'd been fine when I left, well and positive and full of life, and she said she was going to explore my suggestion of taking up a painting course. Portraits, not landscapes. When I got back to the house, the front door stood open. Even as I unbuckled my seatbelt and got out of the car, I knew. I walked in, calling her name, looking everywhere, but my voice just echoed through empty rooms. Every mirror in the house had been smashed. The ornate mirror in the bedroom, the one my mother had left me, lay in pieces on the wooden floor. The little cavity in the wall behind it, holding nothing but an absence and the faint tang of salt water.